The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion is a beautiful account of the days that she spent after her husband passed away and how she tried to make sense of each passing day. And she beautifully talks about these moments in her book. And she says, "We are not idealized wild things. We are imperfect mortal beings, aware of that mortality even as we push it away, failed by our very complication, so wired that when we mourn our losses, we also mourn, for better or for worse, ourselves, as we were, as we are no longer, as we will one day not be at all." And if you're someone who really enjoyed this account of grief, of loss in the Year of Magical Thinking, I'm going to share 4 books with you that you would cherish deeply. Hi everyone, welcome to Kitaabi Cabins. मेरा नाम वानी है, and in this video, I am going to talk to you about books that you must read if you are someone who's interested in the process of grief, or if you know somebody who's grieving and you would just like to understand them a little better. The first book is H is for Hawk. It's by Helen Macdonald, and I came across this book back in 2019. Now, Helen Macdonald lost her father. She was particularly close to him, and in order to deal with his death, she adopted a hawk. And it was particularly crazy because the hawk was somebody who was very difficult to tame. But H is for Hawk is actually an account of her trying to tame this hawk. And in this process, she tames herself. What follows in H is for Hawk is a beautiful account of her struggles. The days she would fail, the days she would manage, and at the end of the season, how she was able to deal with whatever that was going on her inside. The next book that I want to recommend is Notes on Grief. Notes on Grief actually looks at grief as a kind of education, a particular lesson that can be pretty harsh, something you don't see coming your way, but it comes anyway and you have to learn how to sit through this. There is a beautiful line in the book which says, "Grief is a cruel kind of education." You learn how ungentle mourning can be, how full of anger. You learn how glib condolences can feel. You learn how much grief is about language, the failure of language, and the grasping for language. The author talks about how it feels to be one in millions of people to be grieving. And she beautifully connects the dots to individual grief and then feeling just ordinary, and sometimes feeling you're not doing enough when there are people going through worse. And I think this is an emotion everyone goes through, where you think your grief is not enough to be grieved. The next book that I want to talk to you about is one of my favorites. It's called Grief is a Thing with Feathers. It's a beautiful take on Ted Hughes' Crow, which he wrote after the death of Sylvia Plath. हमारे protagonist का नाम भी Ted Hughes है, and it actually follows a man, his 2 sons, when they're grieving the loss of the mother, that is the man's wife. They're visited by Crow, who is our antagonist, and slowly you will see the transition of the Crow. Initial pages, whenever he speaks, there is a crow sounds that he makes, and towards the end of the book, that sound completely disappears. This book beautifully talks about how the process of grief looks like for other people versus how it looks like for people who are grieving. After a point when people ask you as to how something happened, you've memorized your answers, and without feeling, you can narrate to them what happened and sum up the entire incident for them. This book also has a beautiful quote about moving on, and the author writes, "Moving on as a concept is for stupid people, because any sensible person knows grief is a long-term project. I refuse to rush the pain that is thrust upon us. Let no man speed or slow or fix." And the last book that I want to talk to you about is the book that we read at the beginning of this year in a book a month, The Lonely City by Olivia Lang. Olivia Lang talks about grief as something that is not present because of the loss of somebody or the absence of somebody. It is there because you don't feel enough, and you're grieving for something that you wish there was. It talks about loneliness. And she beautifully writes, "I don't believe the cure for loneliness is meeting someone, not necessarily. I think it's about 2 things. Learning how to befriend yourself and understanding that many of the things that seem to afflict us as individuals are in fact a result of larger forces of stigma and exclusion, which can and should be resisted. Lonely City mein Olivia Lang covered a lot of artists. She also covered how their loneliness affected the art they built eventually. And in each such thing, and I think we never touched upon this, but we found that in their loneliness, they were grieving for things that they wished there were. But the moment they would come closer to finding something or getting something they particularly thought they needed, they would still run away from it. Not because they were scared or afraid, but because they couldn't understand what was it that brought the isolation. And that is something that became one major reason for them grieving alone. So these are my recommendations on grief and loss. And let me know how you like them. Let me know if you've read any of them. And if you have more recommendations for me, let me know in the comments below. And I will be back with another recommendation for you guys in my next episode. Until then, keep reading and do share and subscribe to Kitaabi Cabins. We're going to try and bring forward a lot more content around books, go in depth and dive deep into books, authors, writing, and anything and everything that's related to books. So do share and subscribe.